I sold 40 acres of land for this moment, and the first thing my daughter-in-law said to me was, "You smell like a barn." I heard her before I even stepped through the front door, her voice light and amused, like she was commenting on the weather, not on me, not on the woman who had just traded an entire lifetime for the chance to be closer to her son. And for a second, I stood there on the porch with my suitcase in my hand, staring at the polished black handle, noticing how out of place it looked against the clean white siding of the house, like it didn't belong here any more than I apparently did. And I remember thinking that if I turned around right then, if I walked back down those 3 concrete steps and called a cab and went anywhere else, I could pretend I never heard it, that I never came. But instead I adjusted my grip, lifted my chin, and walked in as if nothing had happened, as if her words had missed me completely, and she smiled when she saw me, that bright, practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, and said, "Oh, Eleanor, we didn't expect you so early," as if I were a delivery that had arrived ahead of schedule, not family, never family. And Ryan stood just behind her, my son, my boy, the one who used to run barefoot across freshly cut hay and come home laughing with dirt on his cheeks. And he gave me a quick hug, light and brief, like he was afraid of wrinkling his shirt. And I noticed the way he stepped back almost immediately, his hands sliding into his pockets, his eyes drifting anywhere but my face. And I told myself he was just tired, that the city had changed him, that life had changed him, because it was easier than admitting that maybe I no longer fit into the version of his life he had built here, inside this spotless house where everything gleamed, the floors, the countertops, even the air felt polished. And I suddenly became aware of my shoes, the faint dust along the edges, the calluses on my hands, the things that had never mattered before, not on the farm, not in the life I had built piece by piece over 40 years, a life I had folded up and sold for a number on a bank statement and the promise of family dinners and shared mornings. And Chloe gestured toward a narrow hallway and said, "We set up a space for you." And I followed her, my suitcase wheels rolling softly behind me. And she opened a door to a small room that looked more like an afterthought than a place to live, a bed pushed against the wall, a single lamp, no pictures, no warmth. And she said, "It should be fine for now." And I nodded, because I have always known how to make do, how to take what I'm given and shape it into something livable. But as I set my suitcase down on that bare floor, I realized something had already shifted, something quiet but permanent, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. And I thought about the farmhouse I had left behind, the wide porch, the wind moving through the fields, the smell of soil after rain, things she would probably call dirty, things I once called home. And I understood, standing therein, that small, borrowed room, that I hadn't just traded one life for another. I had stepped into a place where I was already being measured, already being judged, and already being planned for. And for the first time since signing those papers, I wondered if I had made a mistake. But I didn't say it out loud. I didn't say anything at all, because silence, I have learned, is where the truth begins to show itself. I did not unpack that night, not completely. I only opened my suitcase enough to take out what I needed, a nightgown, my toothbrush, the small framed photograph of the farmhouse that I kept wrapped in a sweater, and I placed it face down on the nightstand because I was not sure I was ready to look at it yet. Not in that room, not in that house where everything felt temporary except the feeling that I was the one thing that did not belong. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the soft footsteps above me, the distant sound of a television playing something I could not quite make out. And it struck me how different silence could feel depending on where you were, because on the farm silence had always been full, filled with wind and distant engines and the rhythm of a life that made sense. But here the silence felt controlled, sealed in, like even the walls had rules. And I lay down eventually, but I did not sleep much. And when morning came, I woke before the sun out of habit, my body still set to a schedule that no longer existed. And for a moment I forgot where I was. I expected to hear the creak of old wood, the call of birds across open land, but instead there was only stillness and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere nearby. And I got dressed quietly, choosing one of my cleaner shirts, smoothing it down as best as I could, aware in a way I had never been before of how I might look to someone else. And when I stepped into the kitchen, I found it already spotless, every surface shining, everything in its place, and Chloe stood at the counter with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone, and she glanced up briefly, her eyes moving over me in a quick assessment before she said, "Good morning," in a tone that sounded polite but empty, and I nodded and said the same, keeping my voice even, and I reached for a cabinet, thinking I would make myself some coffee, but she spoke again before I could open it. "We usually keep things organized in here, so just let me know what you need." And her words were soft but precise, like a boundary being drawn without ever being named, and I paused, my hand still on the cabinet handle, then let it fall back to my side and said, "Of course," because I understood what she meant even if she did not say it directly. And Ryan came in a few minutes later, already dressed for work, his tie slightly crooked, and I almost reached out to fix it the way I used to, the way I had done for years, but I stopped myself, because something about the distance in his eyes told me that gesture would not be welcome anymore. And he smiled at me, quick and distracted, and said, "Did you sleep okay, Mom?" And I said yes, because it was easier than explaining the truth, and he poured himself coffee, kissed Chloe on the cheek, and within minutes he was gone, the front door closing with a quiet finality that seemed to echo through the house. And Chloe set her cup down and began wiping the already clean counter, her movements careful and deliberate, and I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, unsure of where I fit in that space, unsure of what I was allowed to touch, to use, to be, and then I stepped back, retreating without being told, and returned to my room, closing the door gently behind me. And as I sat on the edge of that narrow bed again, I realized something else had changed, something subtle but undeniable. I was no longer a guest being welcomed. I was a presence being managed, and the difference between those two things is not loud. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself in small moments, in paused hands, in careful words, in doors that closed just a little too quickly. And I began to understand that whatever place I thought I had here, it had already been decided for me before I ever arrived. I learned the rules of that house without anyone ever explaining them to me, not directly, not in words that could be argued with or questioned, but in the small corrections that came wrapped in politeness, in the way Chloe would pause just long enough before speaking, as if deciding how to phrase something in a way that sounded helpful instead of controlling. And on the third morning, I made the mistake of trying to be useful, because that is what I had always done. That is how I had lived my life. I woke early, dressed quietly, and went into the kitchen before anyone else was there. And for a brief moment it felt almost familiar, the stillness, the soft light coming through the window, and I thought maybe if I made breakfast, something simple, something warm, it would feel like a home again. So I found the eggs in the refrigerator, carefully placed in a clear container, and I hesitated before taking them, as if I needed permission from the air itself, but I told myself I was overthinking, that this was my family, that I did not need to ask to cook in my son's house, and I started moving slowly, gently, as if I could make no sound at all, cracking the eggs into a bowl, reaching for a pan, turning the stove on low, everything measured, everything careful, and I had just set the pan down when Chloe's voice came from behind me, calm and composed. "We usually do not cook in the mornings. It leaves a smell that lingers." And I turned slightly, holding the spatula in my hand, and she stood there in the doorway, watching me with that same polite expression, not angry, not raised, just firm, and I nodded immediately, saying, "Of course," and turned the stove off, sliding the pan back as if it had never been used, and I cleaned everything I had touched, wiping the counter twice, placing the eggs back exactly where I had found them, and she stepped forward then, inspecting the space without making it obvious, running her fingers lightly across the surface before giving a small satisfied nod. And that was the moment I understood that usefulness was not something she wanted from me. Not here, not in her house. And later that afternoon I tried again in a different way. I noticed a basket of laundry near the hallway and instinctively reached for it, thinking I could fold it, make myself less of a burden, but she stopped me again, this time with a small laugh. "Oh, you do not have to worry about that. I have a system." And the word system hung in the air longer than it should have, like a quiet warning, and I withdrew my hands, folding them together instead, standing there with nothing to do, nowhere to go. And when Ryan came home that evening, I watched the way she moved around him, efficient and precise, handing him a glass of water before he asked, adjusting his jacket as if it were part of her routine, and he thanked her, smiling in a way I had not seen in a long time, and I realized that everything in that house had a place, a purpose, a function, everything except me, and I began to notice more things after that. The way conversations shifted slightly when I entered a room. The way Chloe would lower her voice just enough to make me aware that I was not meant to hear. The way Ryan would check his phone mid-sentence, creating an easy escape from anything that might require him to take a side. And none of it was loud. None of it could be pointed to as a single moment of rejection. But together it formed something undeniable, something steady and deliberate. And that evening, as I sat alone in my room, the door closed just enough to hear the faint murmur of their voices down the hall, I realized that I was not adjusting to their life. I was being quietly moved around inside it, like a piece of furniture that did not match the rest of the room but had not yet been removed. That night, I finally turned the photograph over, the one I had carried with me wrapped in a sweater like something fragile, something that could break if it was exposed too quickly, and I held it in both hands, studying the edges where the paper had softened over time, the colors slightly faded but still true enough to remember, the wide porch stretching across the front, the fields beyond it rolling out in quiet confidence, not perfect, not polished, but real in a way that did not need approval from anyone. And I could almost feel the weight of the air there, the kind that settled into your lungs and made you breathe deeper without thinking. And I remembered the mornings when the sun would rise over the fence line, slow and steady, and I would already be awake, coffee in hand, standing on that porch listening to the world come alive in its own time, not rushed, not controlled, just honest. And I thought about how many years I had spent building that life, not all at once, not easily, but piece by piece, decision by decision, choosing every board, every repair, every season that demanded something different from me. And I remembered Ryan as a boy, his shoes always somewhere they were not supposed to be, his laughter carrying across the fields, his small hands gripping mine when he was learning how to walk through uneven ground. And I remembered how proud I had been the first time he told me he wanted something more, something beyond the farm, how I had smiled and told him that was exactly what he should want, that he should go, that he should build something bigger than what I had. And I had meant it, every word, because love does not hold. It lets go, even when it costs more than you expect. And when my husband passed, the house grew quieter, not empty, but changed, like something essential had shifted just out of reach. And I stayed there for years after, maintaining everything the way we had built it together, telling myself I was not alone because the land still knew me, because the walls still held our history. And then Ryan started calling less. His voice always rushed, always somewhere else. And when he finally said, "Mom, you should come live with us. You do not need to be out there by yourself," I heard concern in his words. I heard care, and I chose to believe that was the whole truth, not just a part of it. And selling the farm was not one decision. It was 100 small ones stacked together, each one a quiet goodbye, each one a step further away from everything I understood. I remember walking through each room before the papers were signed, touching the door frames, the kitchen counter, the window by the sink where I had stood through countless mornings, and I told myself I was not losing anything. I was moving forward. I was choosing family. And when I handed over the keys, I felt something settle inside me, something final but not regretful, because I believed I was trading one kind of home for another, that what I was giving up would be replaced by something just as solid, just as real. And sitting there now on that narrow bed with the photograph resting in my lap, I realized that I had not just left a place behind. I had left a version of myself that knew exactly where she stood in the world. And here, in this quiet, carefully managed house, I was still trying to understand what I had become in its place. The call came the next morning just as I was folding the same sweater I had unpacked and repacked twice already. Not because it needed folding, but because I needed something to do with my hands. And when my phone lit up with a number I recognized, I hesitated for a moment before answering, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Because somewhere deep inside me, I already knew that whatever waited on the other end was not going to be simple. And when I finally said hello, the voice that responded was calm, measured, and familiar in a way that reached back into a part of my life I had not touched since I left the farm behind. It was Mr. Harlan, my attorney, the same man who had handled the sale of my property, the same man who had sat across from me at that long wooden table as I signed away 40 years of work with a steady hand and a steady voice. And he did not waste time with pleasantries. He said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I wanted to follow up with you personally, just to confirm that everything has been transferred and that you are comfortable with how the funds are being managed." And I paused, glancing around the small room as if the walls themselves might have an answer for me. And I said, "Yes, everything was finalized before I left." And there was a brief silence on the line, not empty, but deliberate, the kind that carries weight. And then he said, "And you are the only authorized signer on that account, correct?" And something about the way he asked that question, not suspicious, not alarmed, just precise, made something shift quietly in my chest, like a piece of a puzzle being nudged into place without fully revealing the picture. And I answered, "Yes, that is correct." And he continued, "Good. I just wanted to be certain. We have had situations before where family members assume access without proper authorization, and I always prefer to make sure my clients are protected." And I thanked him, keeping my tone even. But after we ended the call, I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, replaying his words, not what he said, but why he said it. Because Mr. Harlan was not a man who made unnecessary calls. He did not check in without reason. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that his concern had not come from nowhere. It had come from experience, from patterns he had seen before, patterns that suddenly felt less distant than they should have. And later that day, as I stepped into the hallway, I heard voices from the living room, low but clear enough to understand. Chloe's voice carrying that same controlled tone she used when she wanted something to sound reasonable. And she said, "It is not like she needs all of it right now. It would make more sense to move things into a joint structure, just for convenience." And Ryan responded, quieter, hesitant, "I do not know, Chloe. It is her money." And she let out a small breath, not frustrated, not angry, just patient. "Exactly. And we are trying to make things easier for her. She does not understand how all of this works anymore. And if something happens, it will be a mess." And I stood there without moving, not because I was shocked, but because I was listening, really listening. And for the first time since I arrived, their words were no longer passing through me without meaning. They were settling, taking shape, forming something solid. And I realized then that what Mr. Harlan had said was not a coincidence. It was a warning, quiet and professional, but a warning nonetheless. And as I stepped back into my room, closing the door gently behind me, I did not feel hurt the way I might have days before. I felt something else entirely, something clearer, something steadier, because the confusion that had followed me since I arrived was beginning to fade, and in its place, understanding was starting to take hold, not loud, not dramatic, but certain in a way that left no room for doubt. The next morning, I did something I had not done since I arrived. I stopped trying to fit into their rhythm and instead returned to my own. I woke early, not out of habit this time, but out of choice, and I sat at the small desk by the window in my room with my phone in my hand, staring at the reflection of myself in the dark glass before the sun had fully risen. And for the first time since I stepped into that house, I allowed myself to think clearly, not emotionally, not as a mother hoping to be welcomed, but as a woman who had spent decades making decisions that carried real consequences. And I realized that I had been moving through the past few days as if I were a guest who needed permission to exist, when in reality, I was the one who had given up everything to be there. And that shift, small as it was, changed the way everything around me began to look. The room was no longer just temporary. It was intentional. The politeness was no longer kindness. It was control. And the conversations I had overheard were no longer misunderstandings. They were plans. And once I saw it that way, I could not unsee it. And I picked up my phone and called Mr. Harlan back, not because I needed reassurance, but because I needed clarity. And when he answered, I spoke calmly, asking him to walk me through every detail of the account, every protection, every condition that had been set in place during the sale of the farm. And he did not rush. He explained everything carefully, confirming that the funds were solely under my name, that no secondary access had been granted, that any changes would require my direct authorization in person. And as he spoke, I felt something settle inside me, not relief exactly, but alignment, as if the ground beneath me had stopped shifting. And when the call ended, I sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence return. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt clear. And later that day, I moved through the house differently, not noticeably, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a way that allowed me to observe without reacting. I watched Chloe as she moved through her routines, efficient and controlled, always a step ahead, always aware of where everything was, and I noticed the way she glanced at me occasionally, not with hostility, but with calculation, as if she were measuring time, waiting for something. And Ryan came home earlier than usual that afternoon, his expression slightly tense, his movements less automatic, and they sat together in the living room, their voices low but not quiet enough to disappear entirely. And I remained in the hallway just long enough to catch the shape of their conversation, not every word, but enough to understand the direction. Chloe saying, "We just need to bring it up the right way, make it sound like it is for her benefit," and Ryan responding, "I do not want to push her," and Chloe replying, "You are not pushing, you are helping. She just does not know what is best for her anymore." And I stepped away then, not because I had heard something new, but because I had heard enough. And as I returned to my room, closing the door behind me with the same quiet care I had used every day since arriving, I realized that whatever uncertainty had followed me here was gone, replaced by something far more steady. I was no longer trying to understand what they were doing. I understood it now, and more importantly, I understood what I needed to do next, not loudly, not immediately, but carefully, the way I had always handled things that mattered, because some decisions are not made in a moment. They are prepared, shaped over time, and when they finally reveal themselves, they do not need to be explained to anyone but yourself. They chose dinner to bring it up, not because it was the right moment, but because it was the most controlled one. The table set neatly, the lighting soft, everything arranged in a way that made difficult conversations feel almost reasonable, and I could see it in the way Chloe moved that evening. A little more deliberate than usual, her tone slightly warmer, as if she were preparing a stage, and Ryan avoided my eyes more than he had all week, which told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken, and we sat down together, the three of us, plates placed carefully, utensils aligned, and for a few minutes they spoke about ordinary things, work, traffic, something about a neighbor's renovation, and I listened, nodding when appropriate, letting the rhythm settle, because I understood now that timing mattered more than anything. And then Chloe set her fork down gently, not abruptly, just enough to signal a shift, and she looked at me with that same composed expression, and said, "Eleanor, we have been thinking about how to make things more comfortable for you." And I met her gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not defensive, just present, and she continued, "This is a big adjustment, moving from the country to the city, and we want to make sure everything is set up in a way that supports you long term." And her words were careful, chosen, layered in concern that sounded practiced rather than felt, and Ryan added quietly, "We just want what is best for you, Mom." And I noticed the way he said it, not with certainty, but with something closer to obligation, and Chloe leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table, and said, "We were thinking it might be helpful to consolidate your finances, just to make things easier. You know, simplify everything. Put it under one structure so Ryan can help manage it if needed." And there it was, not hidden, not overheard from a distance, but placed directly in front of me with a calmness that suggested they believed it was already decided. And for a moment I said nothing, not because I was unsure, but because silence, when used correctly, has a way of revealing more than questions ever could. And Chloe filled that space almost immediately, continuing, "It would just give everyone peace of mind, especially as things change over time." And I watched her as she spoke, the slight tilt of her head, the measured pace of her voice, the way she never once looked at Ryan while explaining what he was supposed to be part of, and I turned my attention to him then, holding his gaze just long enough for him to understand that I was asking him, without words, if this was truly what he wanted, and he hesitated, just briefly, before nodding once, a small motion that carried more weight than anything he could have said, and I felt something settle inside me again, not disappointment, not even sadness, but clarity, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation, and I placed my fork down with the same quiet precision Chloe had used moments before, and I said, "I see," not as a question, not as agreement, just as acknowledgement, and neither of them spoke immediately after that, because they were waiting, expecting a response that would move their plan forward. And I let that silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for them to feel it, long enough for them to realize that whatever they thought this conversation would be, it was not unfolding the way they expected. And in that moment, sitting at that perfectly arranged table in a house that had never truly been mine, I understood something with complete certainty. They had planned this carefully, but they had planned it around a version of me that no longer existed. Chloe smiled when I did not answer right away, not a wide smile, not a genuine one, but the kind that assumes agreement will come if given enough time. And Ryan shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. And I could see it clearly now, the expectation hanging between them, quiet but firm, as if my role in that moment was simply to catch up to a decision they had already made. And I let my hands rest calmly in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing, grounding myself in something that belonged only to me. And I said, "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," keeping my tone even, neither accepting nor rejecting, just observing. And Chloe nodded immediately. "It is, but it is the kind of thing families do for each other." And there it was again, the careful framing, the gentle pressure wrapped in something that sounded like care. And I turned slightly toward Ryan, giving him space to speak if he wanted to, but he only nodded again, his agreement quieter this time, almost rehearsed. And I realized then that this was not a conversation meant to include me. It was a presentation, and I was expected to approve it. And instead of pushing back, instead of questioning, I simply inclined my head and said, "I understand." And I watched the subtle shift in Chloe's expression, the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way she leaned back in her chair as if a small victory had been secured, and dinner continued after that, the topic moving on as if nothing significant had just taken place, as if the future of my life had not just been discussed in measured tones over neatly arranged plates. And I finished my meal quietly, excused myself at the appropriate moment, and returned to my room with the same calm steps I had used every day since arriving. But this time the calm was different. It was not uncertainty. It was intention, and once the door was closed behind me, I sat down at the desk. Again, the same place I had chosen that morning, and I took out my phone, not hesitating this time, not questioning, and I opened the banking application, reviewing the account carefully, line by line, not because I doubted what Mr. Harlan had told me, but because I wanted to see it for myself, to understand exactly what I still held. And the numbers were there, unchanged, steady, untouched by anyone but me. And I felt something settle deeper within me, not relief, not satisfaction, but control. And I began to think differently then, not about what they were planning, but about how they believed I would respond. They expected confusion, hesitation, maybe even gratitude for their involvement. And I understood now that their plan depended entirely on that version of me, the one who would hand things over because it seemed easier, because it felt like the right thing to do. And I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that realization take shape fully, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made before it is spoken. And I knew then that I did not need to confront them. Not yet. I did not need to explain anything, because explanations are given to people who are willing to listen. And that was not what this was. This was something else entirely, something that required patience, the kind I had learned over years of watching seasons change slowly, the kind that does not rush, does not react, but waits for the right moment to act. And as I turned off the light and laid down on that narrow bed, the room no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt temporary, and there is a difference between those two things. Unfamiliar can become comfortable, but temporary carries a quiet certainty. It means you are not staying. And for the first time since I arrived, that thought did not bring discomfort, it brought clarity. The next day, I did not wait for anything to happen. I created it, not in a way that would draw attention, not in a way that would feel like a reaction, but in the same quiet, deliberate manner I had used all my life when something needed to be handled properly. And after Ryan left for work and Chloe settled into her usual routine, I stepped out of the house with nothing more than my purse and my phone, moving through the front door without hesitation, without explanation, because no one had asked me where I was going before, and I did not see a reason to start asking for permission now. And the air outside felt different, not cleaner, not better, just open in a way the house was not. And I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting to the space, reminding myself that I still knew how to move through the world on my own, and I called for a rideshare, giving the driver the address of Mr. Harlan's office. And during the drive, I watched the city pass by in clean lines and controlled patterns, buildings rising neatly beside each other, everything structured, everything contained, and it reminded me of the house in a way that made me understand something more clearly. This life was built on order, on systems, on appearances that held everything in place, and people like Chloe thrived in that environment because they knew how to shape it, how to use it. And when I arrived at the office, I stepped inside with the same calm I had carried since the night before, greeting the receptionist, taking a seat, waiting without impatience, because time had never been something I feared. And when Mr. Harlan finally called me in, he looked at me with a brief moment of recognition that carried more understanding than his words needed to express, and I sat across from him and said simply, "I would like to review everything again." And he nodded, not surprised, not questioning, just prepared. And we went through each document carefully, every clause, every protection, every line that defined what belonged to me and what did not. And I asked him to make something very clear, something that could not be misinterpreted. I asked him to ensure that no one, not even family, could access or manage those funds without my direct, written authorization, and he assured me that it was already structured that way, but he also offered to add an additional layer, something that would require my presence for any changes, something that would prevent even the suggestion of convenience from becoming control, and I agreed without hesitation, signing the updated documents with the same steady hand I had used when I sold the farm, because this time I understood exactly what I was protecting. And when I left his office, I did not feel different in any visible way. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden transformation, but something had settled fully into place, something that had been forming quietly since the moment I stepped onto that porch and heard Chloe's voice. And on the way back, I stopped at a small real estate office, not because I had a plan yet, but because I wanted information. I wanted to see what options existed beyond the walls of that house, and I spoke briefly with an agent, asking simple questions, listening more than I spoke, gathering what I needed without revealing anything unnecessary. And by the time I returned to the house later that afternoon, everything appeared exactly the same as when I left. Chloe in the kitchen, the counters spotless, the air controlled, the space arranged perfectly, and she looked up as I entered, her eyes briefly scanning me as if trying to determine where I had been. And I met her gaze calmly, offering nothing, not explanation, not apology, just presence. And I realized then that the balance had already begun to shift, not in a way they could see yet, but in a way that would matter when the time came, because they believed they were guiding me towards something. But what they did not understand was that I had already chosen my direction, and I was no longer standing still long enough for anyone else to decide it for me. They did not wait long to bring it up again, because people who believe they are in control rarely feel the need to be patient. And that evening, Chloe set the table with the same careful precision as before, but this time there was something sharper in the air, something expectant, as if the conversation from the night before had not ended but simply paused. And when Ryan sat down across from me, he looked at me directly for the first time in days, not with warmth, not even with uncertainty, but with a kind of rehearsed resolve, and I understood immediately that whatever hesitation he had shown before had already been replaced. And Chloe began again, her tone just as calm, just as measured, but now more direct. We thought more about what we discussed, and it really would be best to move forward sooner rather than later. And I folded my hands gently on the table, listening without interruption, giving her exactly what she expected on the surface. And she continued, "There are forms we can set up, just basic authorization, nothing complicated. It will make everything easier for all of us." And Ryan added, "It is just to help, Mom, that is all." And I nodded slowly, as if considering their words for the first time, though my decision had already been made long before they sat down, and I said, "You are right about one thing." And both of them leaned in slightly, not noticeably, but enough for me to see that they were waiting, anticipating agreement, and I continued. "Things should be clear, simple, and properly arranged." And Chloe's expression softened, just enough to suggest she believed the conversation was going exactly as planned, and she reached for a folder she had placed beside her chair, sliding it onto the table with quiet confidence, and I did not touch it. Not yet. I simply looked at it, letting the moment stretch, letting their expectations build just a little higher, and then I lifted my gaze back to hers and said, "So I took care of that today." And the shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Her hand paused where it rested on the edge of the folder, Ryan's expression tightening just slightly as he tried to understand what I meant, and I continued, my voice steady, unhurried. "I met with Mr. Harlan this morning. We reviewed everything, every account, every condition, and I made sure that nothing can be changed, accessed, or managed by anyone but me without my direct authorization in person." And I watched as the calm structure Chloe had built began to fracture, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the small ways that reveal truth, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the brief stillness in her posture, the way she withdrew her hand from the folder as if it no longer belonged in front of her. And Ryan looked at me. Then, really looked, and I could see the realization forming behind his eyes, slow but certain. And I added, not as a challenge, but as a fact, there is no need to simplify anything. It is already handled. And silence settled over the table, not the controlled silence of before, but something heavier, something that no one had planned for. And Chloe was the first to speak, her voice still composed, but now carrying a trace of something sharper beneath it. "We were only trying to help." And I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. And I said, "I understand that." And I let that be enough, because explanations were no longer necessary. And as I picked up my fork and continued my meal as if nothing unusual had happened, I felt the shift complete itself fully, not in the room, not in their expressions, but within me, because whatever role they had prepared for me when I arrived, whatever version of me they had expected to guide and manage, it no longer existed. And for the first time since I stepped into that house, I was no longer responding to their plans. I was moving ahead of them. The change after that dinner was immediate, not in words, not in anything that could be pointed to directly, but in the atmosphere of the house itself. The careful balance that Chloe had maintained began to shift in subtle ways, her movements still precise, but now carrying a tension that had not been there before. And Ryan moved through the space more quietly, as if he were trying to avoid stepping into something he did not fully understand. And I continued exactly as I had before, calm, observant, saying only what was necessary, because I had learned that once a person reveals their intentions, there is no need to provoke them further. They will show you everything if you simply allow them the space to do it. And over the next few days I noticed the small adjustments, the way Chloe's tone lost some of its softness, the way her questions became more direct, less disguised. "Did you go somewhere again today?" she asked one afternoon, standing in the kitchen with her arms loosely crossed, and I answered simply, "Yes," offering nothing more. And she waited for a moment, expecting an explanation that did not come, and then she nodded once, turning back to the counter as if the conversation had been sufficient, but I could see the calculation behind her silence, the way she was reassessing, adjusting her approach. And Ryan tried once, later that evening, to speak to me alone, catching me in the hallway with a hesitation that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "Mom, we just want to make sure you are comfortable here," he said, his voice quieter than usual. And I looked at him steadily, not unkindly, but without stepping back into the role he seemed to expect. And I replied, "Comfort is not something someone else can arrange for you." And he did not respond to that, not because he disagreed, but because he did not know how. And I could see it in the way he shifted his weight, in the way his eyes moved past me toward the living room where Chloe was, as if his place had already been decided and he was simply trying to remain within it. And that was when I understood that whatever distance had grown between us had not happened all at once. It had been built slowly, reinforced over time, until it felt normal to him. And I did not try to undo it, because some things, once settled, cannot be forced back into what they used to be. And the following morning I began packing, not dramatically, not all at once, just a few items at a time, folding my clothes carefully, placing them back into the suitcase with the same care I had used when I arrived. But this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty about what I was doing, and I left the photograph of the farmhouse for last, holding it in my hands for a moment longer than the others before placing it gently on top. And when Chloe noticed later that day, she paused in the doorway of my room, her eyes moving over the suitcase, the partially empty dresser, and she said, Are you going somewhere? Her voice controlled but sharper than before, and I met her gaze without resistance and said, yes. And she waited, expecting more, expecting details, explanations, something she could respond to, but I gave her nothing else. And after a brief silence, she said, we were not finished discussing things, and I replied calmly, I was, and that was the end of it, not because the conversation was resolved, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. And that evening, as I zipped my suitcase closed, I realized that leaving did not feel like loss the way I had feared it might. It felt like correction, like stepping back into alignment with something I had temporarily set aside. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, I was not adjusting, not waiting, not observing. I was moving forward again, on my own terms, with a clarity that no longer depended on anyone else's understanding. I left early the next morning, not because I needed to avoid them, but because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood, and the house was quiet in that controlled way I had come to recognize, every surface still, every detail in place, as if nothing had ever shifted within it. And I stood in the doorway for a moment with my suitcase beside me, looking out at the street, the clean lines of the sidewalk, the steady hum of a city already awake, and I did not look back. Immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty, because I knew exactly what I would see if I did, a house that had never been meant to hold me, a life that had already arranged itself without me in it. And when I finally stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet, deliberate motion, it felt less like leaving and more like returning, not to a place, but to myself, and the air felt different again, not because it had changed, but because I had. And as I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, I noticed how steady my footing was, how familiar it felt to move forward without waiting for someone else to define the direction, and the rideshare arrived within minutes, the driver greeting me with a simple nod, and I settled into the back seat, placing my suitcase beside me, watching as the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, not fading dramatically, just becoming another part of the city I was moving through, and I did not feel the pull to hold on to it, because there was nothing there that belonged to me anymore. And as we drove, I reached into my purse and took out the photograph, turning it over once more, not to compare, not to regret, but to remember, and this time I did not place it face down. I held it steady, letting the image settle into me with a clarity that no longer carried confusion, only understanding. And when we arrived at the small real estate office I had visited the day before, I stepped inside with the same calm I had carried through every decision that had brought me here, and the agent recognized me, offering a polite smile as she asked if I had thought more about what I was looking for. And I said, yes, because I had, not just about the property, but about the kind of life I intended to build again. One that did not depend on being accepted into someone else's space. One that did not require permission to exist. And we spoke for a while, reviewing options, locations just outside the city where the air was less confined, where space still existed in a way that felt honest. And I listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, but mostly observing, letting the details form a picture I could step into. And when I left her office with a folder in my hand and a plan beginning to take shape, I felt something settle fully into place, something that had been building quietly from the moment I realized I had mistaken proximity for belonging. And later that afternoon, as I checked into a small, simple rental that would serve as a temporary place until I found something more permanent, I set my suitcase down, opened it slowly, and took out the photograph once again, placing it on the table by the window where the light could reach it, and I stood there for a moment, looking at it, not with longing, not with loss, but with recognition, because what I had thought I left behind was never really gone. It had simply been waiting for me to return to it in my own way. And as I turned away from the window and began unpacking, I understood something with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken out loud. Some people look at where you come from and see something to be cleaned, something to be corrected, something that does not belong in the life they have built, but they are only seeing the surface, and I have lived long enough to know the difference between what is polished and what is real, and I will choose real every time, because real is not something you are given. It is something you build, protect, and walk away with when everything else falls away.